first of all, I should say that my co-presenter, Summer Bland, it's 12:50 a.m. in the morning here in Australia, so she kind of passed out at about midnight. And then I would love to just thank everybody for the warm welcome, and it's just so wonderful to see how far the work has come since the early 2000s, since I became first involved. So I feel very excited, and as I say, it is just lovely to see you. One of the things that we do in Australia, whenever we are presenting at a conference, even over Zoom, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're presenting today. So in my part of Australia, which is Brisbane, we acknowledge the Turrbal people as the traditional custodians of the land. And I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to Indigenous peoples joining us from around the world. And I'm sure that we have many Indigenous people on Zoom with us today. Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting us to present our research today. It's really an honour to do so. The focus of this paper is what happens when workplace mobbing is not simply the conduct of one difficult person, but it's enabled and reinforced or perpetuated by the organisation itself. We are particularly interested in this paper anyway in race, gender, power and organisational vulnerability. The central question for this first presentation is who is targeted and why. Our findings indicate that vulnerability is not random. It is shaped by difference from the dominant group. And I was interested to hear some of our greeters touch on that subject about dominant work groups. And also by the power, which I heard one of our greeters talk about. So it's shaped by difference from the dominant work group and by the power available to define what is happening. That's what we found in our research. So let me begin with how these cases come to us at Workplace Mobbing Australia. Okay, so usually we call this person the target. So you all know who I mean by that. We avoid the word victim. That's the person who's been targeted. So the way it happens is the target seeks legal advice after becoming psychologically injured. In Australia, we have legal redress for people who have been psychologically injured at work. It doesn't mean it's easily available. It isn't easily accessible. You have to have a lot of money and a lot of wherewithal to pursue a psychological claim. So the people who come to us have already got a psychological claim in for injury. The solicitor then refers the matter for an expert assessment using the workplace mobbing framework. So I have to say that not everybody, of course, uses the workplace mobbing framework, but the courts particularly like the framework because it highlights what has happened only too well, and anybody who understands the framework recognises it pretty well straight away. So then what we do, when I say we, Summer and I, what we do is review the history of the workplace behaviour. We look at what we call in Australia psychosocial hazards. And so I'll go through what they are in a moment. But they're all the sorts of things, the tools that organisations use, if you like, to force a person out of their job. And some of those have already been touched on earlier today. And then we need to explain how those matters relate to the worker's injury and legal claim. The case then proceeds to court, or usually it's settled at mediation. The blue arrow, there are no blue arrows for you people. So what I'm going to say is that our role is really important in making sure that the target's narrative is heard by the court. So we're kind of like a middle person who kind of massages or helps the narrative through the legal system so that it's understood at the end of the process. Okay, so The method in kind of figuring all of this out is a series of questions that we ask. And so we look at, these are consistently asked in all the cases. What is the history and nature of the behaviour? Fairly straightforward. Second, what are the relevant laws, codes of practice, standards and organisational guidelines that apply? And that's, you know, that's very much applicable to each state in Australia. Third, does the organisation have a policy framework, a code of conduct, bullying policy or other relevant procedure? We're not that far advanced that we have a workplace, an anti-workplace mobbing policy, but organisations are expected to have an anti-bullying policy. And then we check whether that framework, those policies have actually been followed. However, what we find, as it would be no surprise to you, that we have perfect policies and we have putrid practices. We then ask whether the behaviour is recognised as workplace mobbing. Or that's the particular, because I use that framework, and so I'm very clear that can you identify the various phases of workplace mobbing? And yes, in all the cases we have. And then we consider whether the organisation could reasonably foreseeably have foreseen those risks. A lot of foreseens in there. So we're trying to identify at what point could they see that there was a risk that this person is going to be psychologically injured. And often, you know, they miss the flags, the red flags flying. They're just not looking at those factors. And then finally, we look at was action taken after concerns were raised. Often people will, you know, bring complaints and so on. And what was the organisational response to those? And I'll go through those later, either in this paper or the next one. So these questions take us beyond competing personal accounts, individual accounts, to look at the organisational processes, to look at the psychosocial hazards and the consequences for the worker. So this method was applied across the following research sample. These are from these people who've been channelled our way. We're looking at approximately 200 workers over the past 5 to 6 years. And this is what we found just amongst those people. And you know, there are limitations on this research because we haven't selected these people. They are self-nominating, if you like, self-selected. So because they've made a claim for psychological injury. So the sample size is 200 workers. There were equal numbers of men and women. First Nations people were represented at a higher percentage than the rest of the population. Other cultural groups in Australia, Muslims, Asians and people from what we call culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds are disproportionately represented. Other personal characteristics that do come into it are gender, race, religion, accent, age, disability and mental health differences. So I noticed that, you know, the envy of excellence, I haven't put it in here, but I have noted that what we call the tall poppy syndrome in Australia, that is an element in the research as well, but in scientific sort of analysis that we've done, these are the personal characteristics that have kind of been identified. Those industries most represented, by far, police, ambulance, hospitals, corrections, detention facilities. We have offshore detention facilities in Australia. That probably wouldn't surprise anybody, but that we have a lot of mobbing in those sorts of heavily organised or structured kinds of places where human rights are a bit of an issue, and non-profit organisations, charities and organisations that have been set up to, you know, to look after vulnerable groups. So they're the most represented, but then there are other sectors: education, health, community services, aged care, disability services, local government and universities, So you can see it's very wide-ranging. It's what we found is it isn't limited to any particular part of society. And the clinical status of these participants, they had psychological injuries, including PTSD, major depression, severe anxiety and adjustment disorder, and they've all been psychiatrically assessed as being unable to participate in work at all. So these people have been severely damaged through workplace mobbing processes. They're permanently unfit for work. And yeah, the workers were typically pursuing what we call common law compensation claims. Okay, so when organisations perpetuate workplace mobbing, race, gender, power and organisational vulnerability, who is targeted and why? The second paper we're going to present is on why do organisations escalate rather than resolve workplace mobbing. So anyway, this first one is focusing on who is targeted and why in our study, of course. The strongest predictor we found of being mobbed was being different from the dominant work group. Difference alone does not cause mobbing. The risk arises when difference is combined with exclusion, unequal power, weak psychological safety, and an organisational tendency to accept the dominant group's account without adequate scrutiny. So it's all about a numbers game. What the dominant group thinks kind of goes. And I guess that's where mobbing, the word mobbing relates very well to that concept. A worker may be different because of race, culture, accent, gender, age, disability, religion, professional values, or simply because they challenge established practices or unwritten norms. Once they're marked as like not one of us, ordinary differences that would be accepted normally are reinterpreted as evidence that the worker is difficult, unsafe or unsuitable. We see this most clearly in the treatment of racial and cultural difference. Race was rarely expressed through an explicit statement of racial hostility. In other words, we're not talking about direct discrimination. More often, workers from culturally diverse backgrounds described being misunderstood, isolated, treated as less credible, or required to repeatedly prove their competence. Instead, their communication was questioned, their behaviour was labelled inappropriate, or their cultural manner was interpreted negatively. So the intercultural communication often comes up in the work that we do, the importance of intercultural communication, learning about how to communicate with each other across our diverse backgrounds. The person's identity becomes the lens through which everything they do is interpreted. This does not mean that every criticism of a culturally diverse worker is discriminatory, though. The concern is the pattern. Comparable behaviour is treated differently. Contextual explanations are discounted. Stereotypes shape interpretation and the worker's account receives less weight. Race can therefore operate indirectly through credibility, belonging and organisational decision-making. I mean, none of this is new. Any of us who've worked in this area, there is a plethora of scholarly research on these topics. It's just being on the other end, sort of working in the area with these people and seeing these issues, they're still there. They haven't kind of really disappeared as much as I thought they might have done. So I was really quite surprised by some of the research, particularly around First Nations workers. Lateral violence is an issue that I don't know whether, I'm sure it's an issue that has been written about in the Canadian situation, but in Australia, lateral violence amongst systemically oppressed communities and those experiencing historical disadvantage, such as our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, is well recognised. and a lot of scholarly work has been produced in that area. Accent is another one that ties in with the culturally and linguistically diverse. All I can say is God help you in Australia if you have an accent. It's a particularly visible marker of difference. An accent is interpreted as poor communication or a poor attitude, when the actual issue is simply linguistic or cultural difference. And that interpretation can have significant consequences. Once the worker is labelled a poor communicator, misunderstandings are attributed to them. Their professional competence may be questioned, and further complaints are more readily accepted as confirmation of the label. You know, there's that kind of, you know, there's more and more evidence gathered to support that this person is incompetent, and really it's all to do with this intercultural communication. A fair response separates communication content from familiarity of speech. It asks what was actually said, whether expectations were clear, whether others contributed to the misunderstanding, and whether the same standard is being applied consistently. Accent should not become a proxy for capability, cooperation or belonging, as it so often does. Once again, in the same sort of area, migrant workers. In this study, we found that migrant workers who were often newcomers to both the organisation and the broader employment system are tend to be targeted. They could be isolated from the dominant group, dependent on the employer for income, professional recognition or visa stability. Often migrant workers in Australia are dependent on complying with whatever requirements they have in the workplace because retaining their visa depends on that, and they're less likely to complain, so they're particularly vulnerable. A worker who does not, say, complain early may not be unaffected by workplace mobbing. They may be calculating the risk of losing their employment, their sponsorship, references or career opportunities. They've also got limited knowledge of workplace rights and are unfamiliar with the complaint processes that increase vulnerability. By the time the worker does speak up, the behaviour is already entrenched, and there's kind of not a lot that they can do by that point.
Sorry to interrupt. You have 5 minutes left for this presentation.
Okay, okay, thank you. I'll keep moving. Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about the dominant group for a little bit. The dominant group is not necessarily a formally organised group of bullies, but sometimes they are. Sometimes they do sit around on the veranda and plan a person's downfall. And however, that's in this particular study, that's kind of not what emerged. Often it was simply the network whose version of events became accepted as the organisational truth. And that dominance comes from hierarchy, tenure, professional status, cultural similarity, informal relationships, or access to senior decision makers. You know, people reinforce one another's accounts, while the target's different account is seen as defensive, emotional, or unreliable. So a head count is not enough, you know, in terms of 10 people said that Susie Smith is incompetent. That is an inadequate way to make decisions, that mobbing approach. Okay, so power, that was mentioned earlier, that power determines credibility. It shapes whose witnesses are approached, say in any investigation, and I'll be talking about that later, and believed, whose complaints succeed and whose behaviour becomes normalised. Power is not confined, though, to organisational rank. It can come from informal sources, proximity to leaders, control of information, professional authority, long-standing relationships, group membership, or the ability to influence an investigation's terms of reference, for example. When power is uneven, identical conduct is given different meanings. Behaviour by the dominant group is excused as robust management or ordinary conflict, while the target's response is often labelled as misconduct or incapacity. Okay. So I'll talk quickly about psychological safety. Psychological safety in an organisation disappears long before psychological injury occurs. Before a worker develops a diagnosable condition, they have already learned that speaking up is dangerous, support is unavailable, and disagreement carries a personal cost. Early indicators of psychological unsafety include silence in meetings, withdrawal, hypervigilance, repeated checking of communications, and fear of retaliation. If an organisation waits for a medical certificate or compensation claim, prevention has already failed. The best opportunity to intervene is when trust begins to erode and patterns of exclusion or retaliation first become visible. Workers expect, once an organisation receives a complaint, workers expect that their case will be investigated. They expect support, fairness, protection, and resolution of the problems. Support doesn't mean being listened to without
2
any
minutes.
action being taken. Okay, sorry, what was that? How many? Finish?
2 minutes. Mm-hmm. You have 2 minutes.
Okay. Rightio. So I'll talk about reporting, like when people report workplace mobbing and then how the organisation actually responds. I'll cover that in the next presentation. But the key messages that I guess I would like people to take away from this presentation is that there are 3 key messages. The first, difference predicts vulnerability. Being outside the dominant group can increase exposure to exclusion, stereotyping, and reduce credibility. Second, power predicts outcomes. It determines which account becomes accepted, which conduct is normalised, and whose complaint is acted upon. And third, leadership determines escalation. Leaders can interrupt the pattern of mobbing through fair, culturally informed and risk-based action, or they can reinforce it through silence, alignment, and flawed process.
Okay, time is out.